Okay, and welcome back, students who are taking financial accounting, and we are working on the Chapter 1 problems, Group B, and we're actually on problem 39B. All right, so let me jump down to it. Okay, so we're picking up from where we left off in the previous video. Right? And in the previous video, we were going to do the requirements. So we have to identify um, each amount as shown as an asset, a liability, equity, revenue, or an equity account. So let me erase all of this. All right, so accounts payable. Whenever you see payable, immediately you think something we owe, which is a liability. Receivable is something that's owed to us, so that's an asset. It's something we own. Advertising expense, an expense again is on the income statement, which gets closed out to retained earnings, so that's equity. Building is something we own, so that's an asset. Cash is our cash, that's an asset. Common stock is equity. Dividends are equity because the dividends are taken out of our profit or loss, which is on the income statement, and that gets closed out to the stockholders' equity. Equipment is something we own, so that's an asset. Insurance expense, whenever you see expense, that's going to be equity. Interest expense is equity. Land is something we own, so that's an asset. Note payable, again, you see the word payable, think in terms of liabilities. Expenses and equity. Rent expense is equity. Salary expense is equity. Payable, salary payable is a liability. Now notice you have a salary expense and a salary payable, right? Don't just automatically assume. Look at that last word, expense or payable, in order to make the determination. Revenues are shown service revenues. Revenues are on the income statement, so they're closed out to the retained earnings, which is equity. And then supplies. Supplies are something we own, so that's an asset. Now the reason why I went up here and said look at the last word being expense or payable to determine whether it was equity or liability is for the simple reason that I'm looking at supplies here. Okay, the supplies, it just says supplies, so I'm going to assume that that is something we own because we bought the supplies and it's part of our inventory. But if it had said supplies expense, then obviously the expense would be on the income statement, and that would mean that this is an equity account. Okay, but because we don't see the word supplies expense there, we don't see expense, I think in terms of an asset. Okay, so that's number one. All right, now it says prepare the income statement and statement of retained earnings for the year ended October 31st. So new slide here. And again, I'm going to abbreviate, take certain shortcuts. But when it comes to formatting, I mean, if I'm working this problem out, on just a sheet of paper as a homework problem, or I'm in a business and I'm actually, creating this, yeah, I'm going to take these here shortcuts because I don't want to spend an awful lot of time doing this, right? But realize that when I go to type it up in a Word document, I'm not going to abbreviate. I'm going to have capitalization. I have things formatted correctly in columns, and I discussed all of this in the previous exercise videos. So even though I'm working through this and I'm going to try to, take the shortcuts to keep the amount of time to do this down, realize that when you're actually creating it, you have to follow, the generally accepted accounting principles, and you have to, format correctly. Okay. So go back and watch those other videos in order to be able to know what the correct formatting is. So this is Alpha Inc. So the name of the business, the name of the financial statement is income statement. So that's next. And notice that this is center aligned. And then we put in the header date. And this was for the year ending, and the date can either be written out as October 31st, 2014, or I could write it in as a, just numbers. More often than not, it gets written out. Okay, and if it gets written out, it does not get abbreviated as OCT period. All right. Okay, so that's when I'm doing the financial statements. Remember, in the previous videos on the exercises, I said I follow a process so that I make sure I'm getting everything and that I'm formatting my financial statement correctly. So the first thing I do is I set my header, right? And that's what I have right here. Okay. Then the next thing I do is I write revenues, and I write expenses, because these are my categories of accounts. Now, I start out with revenues, and I will list all of my general ledger accounts for my revenues. And what I do, I'm indenting. Okay. And in this case here, all I have is just one account called service revenue. And again, I'm abbreviating here. Right? Now, if I had more than one, let's say I'm just going to call it sales revenue. I'm just adding this in. Obviously, we don't have one of those accounts. Then I would indent again and label it total revenue. And if I do it that way, because I'm having a mathematical calculation, over here on the right, I have, I think in terms of columns. Remember, the lines on the paper don't mean anything. I can have 4 columns, but I'm only going to use this one and this one, okay? The first 2. I don't have to use these other columns. If I have only 1 column on a paper, right? If I just had this 1 column on the paper, well then I would create a second column, all right? The lines on the paper don't mean anything, and as you can see by my using a blank screen here, I could use blank copy paper, okay? So since I'm adding 2 numbers together, okay, what I'm going to do is, that's going to be a mathematical calculation, so I'd want to put those amounts here in the left-hand column and put the total amount, the summation of that calculation, in the right-hand column as my total revenue. So I have my figure here for service revenue and my figure here for sales revenue, and I'd put the total amount over here in total revenue. This here is my total revenue, and I would do the same thing down here, which is what we have to do for our expenses, and I would have my total expenses here. So when I'm looking in this column, I see revenues less my expenses to give me my profit or loss. And these calculations support this number, and these calculations support this number, and that's why they're 1 column to the left. But for this particular problem, we only have the 1 account, service revenue. So we don't need to do a mathematical calculation because there's only one account, and that amount happens to be 210,000. So that immediately goes in the rightmost column, okay? And since it's the first number in the column, we put a $sign to denote that this is a dollar amount, okay? We don't have to put in total revenue because all we're doing is, putting one number here and then adding it once and putting it here, doesn't make any sense, okay? And obviously, we're not going to draw an underline to show a calculation because why? We only have one number. So we don't really need the total revenue description or amount over here. Having the 1 general ledger account of 210,000 suffices. But now with expenses, it's different, okay? We have to list all of our expenses. Remember, I'm indenting here. So I have salaries expense, rent, and I'm getting these, I'm getting these from this information right here, okay? Just so you're aware, if you're wondering where I'm getting them from. I'm transferring this information to my financial statements. Right? I have advertising expense. I have interest expense. And again, I'm just abbreviating So I have property tax expense, and for expediency purposes, insurance expense, and when I add those all up, I have a total expense. Okay, so notice I indented here and I indented here. The thought just occurred to me that I'm indenting here. Notice that when I'm going to work through, I'm doing the same thing. I have here and then I indent. Well, I'm going to put the numbers here, and I'm going to, my indentation is my total. You see the relationship there? So maybe that's a little visual for you to be able to keep that in mind. Okay, so I have my total expenses, right? And what I'm going to do here is, since this is a mathematical calculation of more than one number, I'm going to work in the left-hand column. Right? So I'm going to put my dollar sign because it's the first number in the column, and that's 91,300 for the salary expense, 24,000 for the rent, 19,600 for advertising, 7,500 for interest, 4,900 for the property tax, and 3,600 for the insurance expense. And because that's a mathematical calculation, I'm drawing an underline, and I'm putting the total of that calculation in the next right column. So that's 150,900 are my total expenses. I add up all of those, that's the amount I get. Okay. So now that I have my total expenses, right, on the income statement, revenues less expenses gives me my net profit or loss. Well, in this case here, it's income because my revenues are greater than my expenses. So I have net income. And as I said, I'm looking down this column here, so I have revenues less my expenses. This is the mathematical calculation, so I need to draw that underline. And the difference between 210,000 and 150,900 is $59,100. And that gets a dollar sign because it's going to be the end of a calculation. And so I draw my double underline and I put my dollar sign there. And that's what my income statement looks like. Okay. Now, having done this, we do the income statement first. Why? Because we need this 59,100 in order to be able to create our statement of retained earnings, right? So with that, I'm going to start another video and do the statement of retained earnings in the next video. And if you had any questions about doing this, again, go back and watch, exercise 1-28B, and 1-29B. The 29B has the income statement and retained earnings, and 28B had the balance sheet, I believe. Okay, so go back and watch those videos again, and rewatch this. If you still have any questions, feel free to contact an instructor. All right, I'll see you in the next video to do the retained earnings.